The year of our Lord 1889 had bled the land dry. Here in the far-flung territories of the American West, the sun was not a gentle giver of life, but a merciless tyrant. It beat down upon the plains until the grass surrendered, bleaching it to the color of old bone. The wind, a constant, restless spirit, did not cool. It only scoured, lifting the fine, rust-colored dust from the cracked earth and flinging it into the air, into the eyes, into the very soul of anyone foolish enough to be caught in its path. It was a land of harsh truths and little mercy, where survival was a daily negotiation with God and the dirt. Towns like Redemption's Bluff were little more than isolated outposts, clinging to life by a thread of commerce and a deeper cord of stubbornness. They were collections of raw timber buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent emptiness that surrounded them. Law was a flimsy concept here, often bent to the will of the man with the heaviest purse or the quickest draw. Deeper and more unyielding than any sheriff's decree was the town's prejudice. It was a quiet, watchful thing, a set of unwritten rules that governed every interaction. A woman's reputation was her only currency, and once spent, it could never be reclaimed. In Redemption's Bluff, whispers were as deadly as bullets, and a hard glance could seal a person's fate. It was from a future in a place much like this, only colder and farther north in Montana, that Clara Mae Thompson was running. She was fleeing the rumbling wagon of a wedding caravan, a procession that felt more like a funeral march for the life she had once imagined for herself. She was to be married, a transaction finalized by her father, to a man named Alistair Finch, a cattle baron with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that held the cold glint of a winter creek. He was older than her own father, a man whose previous 2 wives had been laid to rest in suspiciously quick succession. Clara, a former governess who valued books and quiet contemplation, was being sold for the price of her father's forgiven debts. The final, bitter argument had happened 10 miles back. Her pleas, her tears, her reasoned arguments about love and choice had broken against her father's stony silence like waves against a cliff. "You will do as you are told," he had said, his voice flat and final. "You will secure this family's future." When she had finally screamed, a raw, desperate sound of pure refusal, he had ordered the driver to halt. In the suffocating silence that followed, he had pointed a rigid finger toward the endless expanse of scorched earth. "Then find your own future out there." He had her small trunk thrown into the dust, and without a backward glance, the caravan had moved on, a slow, lumbering beast carrying her life away from her. She was left with nothing, no money, no food, no water, just the clothes on her back, a wedding dress of simple, cream-colored lace, now smudged with dust and torn at the hem from her frantic attempt to jump from the moving wagon. The dress was a cruel mockery, a symbol of a bondage she had just narrowly escaped, only to be thrust into another. For a long while, she just stood there, a pale, forgotten doll in a world of brown and yellow, watching the dust cloud of the wagons shrink until it was swallowed by the horizon. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The oppressive heat gave way to a sudden, chilling breeze. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, was now massing with clouds the color of a fresh bruise. The storm came without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that turned the dusty road to a thick, clinging mud. The first drops were as large as coins, and within minutes, the world was a gray, roaring chaos, drenched and shivering, her fine dress plastered to her skin. Clara stumbled through the deluge, her eyes scanning desperately for any sign of shelter. She found it in the skeletal remains of an old cattle shed, its roof half collapsed and its walls full of gaps. It smelled of rot and damp earth, but it was a reprieve from the driving rain. Huddled in a corner, wrapping her arms around her trembling body, she listened to the thunder crack and boom like cannon fire across the plains. The cold was a living thing, seeping into her bones, and a profound, terrifying hopelessness began to settle over her. She was going to die here, she thought, not with a bang, but with a shiver, alone in a forgotten shed in the middle of nowhere. Silas Blackwood was not looking for a woman. He was looking for his horse. A skittish bay mare named Daisy had been spooked by a rattlesnake earlier and had bolted, snapping her tether. In this country, a good horse was the difference between life and death, and Silas could not afford to lose her. He rode his steady gelding, Samson, his head bowed against the wind, his oilskin coat shedding the worst of the rain. His face was a map of the land he worked, tanned by the sun, creased by squinting against the glare, his jaw set in a permanent line of grim determination. He was a man made of hard angles and silence, a widower whose grief had settled into him like dust into the floorboards of his empty home. It was Samson who found her first. The horse stopped, ears twitching, and refused to go farther, letting out a low nicker. Silas followed the animal's gaze toward the dilapidated shed. He dismounted, his hand resting instinctively on the worn handle of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Trouble came in many forms out here, and a person hiding in a storm was as likely to be a bandit as a victim. He pushed the creaking door open a few inches and peered into the gloom. What he saw was not a threat. It was a girl, or a young woman, no older than 20, huddled in the corner. She was soaked to the bone, her body racked with violent shivers. Her dress, he noted with a flicker of surprise, looked like a wedding gown, though it was torn and filthy. Her face was pale, her lips blue with cold. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhaustion, like a cornered animal. His first instinct, caution, was quickly overridden by a deeper, more fundamental one. You didn't leave a living creature to the mercy of a storm like this. He let out a slow breath. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You can't stay here. You'll freeze before morning." Clara flinched at the sound of his voice. She could only stare, too cold and frightened to speak. He wasn't a young man, but not old either. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue in his weathered face, held no warmth, only a kind of weary assessment. He sighed, seeing the state she was in. "I'm not going to harm you. My homestead is a mile from here. You can take shelter there until the storm passes." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He offered no comfort, only a practical solution. He turned and walked back to his horse, expecting her to follow. After a moment of hesitation, the primal need for warmth and safety won out over her fear. Pushing her aching limbs to move, Clara stumbled out of the shed and into the rain. He helped her onto his horse with a rough, impersonal grip, and then mounted behind her, his large frame a solid barrier against the wind. The ride was silent, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the chattering of her teeth. The homestead was as stark and unadorned as the man himself. A small, sturdy cabin made of hand-hewn logs, a barn, and a few corrals. Inside, a fire was dying in the stone hearth. The room was clean but spare, furnished with rugged, handmade furniture. It was a space built for function, not comfort, and it was missing the small touches that spoke of a woman's presence. As Silas stoked the fire back to life, a small figure appeared in the doorway of the other room. A little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, stood clutching a worn rag doll. She had Silas's clear blue eyes and a cascade of dark, tangled hair. She didn't speak. She simply watched Clara with a grave, unnerving stillness. There was a hollow look in her eyes, a deep, ancient sadness that didn't belong on the face of a child. "That's Josie," Silas said, not turning from the fire. "My daughter." He handed Clara a rough wool blanket. "Get out of those wet things. You can stand by the fire." He gestured to a privacy screen in the corner. His tone was practical, his gaze averted, granting her a sliver of dignity. Once she was wrapped in the scratchy warmth of the blanket. her wet dress steaming by the hearth. He ladled some thin stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate in silence, acutely aware of the two sets of eyes on her. The man's were assessing, guarded. The child's were simply watching, her expression unreadable but for the profound loneliness that swam in their depths. Clara, who had spent years caring for other people's children, felt a familiar ache of sympathy. This little girl was a ghost in her own home. When the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving a clean, cold silence in its wake, Silas spoke. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, making him look older, wearier. "The road will be impassable for a few days," he said, stating another fact. "You can stay, but I've got a proposition for you." Clara looked up, her heart clenching with a new kind of fear. She knew what a lone woman could expect from a man in a place like this. As if reading her mind, he shook his head. "Not what you're thinking." He paused, choosing his words with care, as if they were heavy stones he had to lift. "My wife, she passed a year ago. Fever." He gestured with his chin toward the silent child, who had not moved from the doorway. "Josie, she needs a woman around, someone to teach her things, to look after her. The work on this ranch is too much for one man to handle and raise a child, right?" He finally looked at her directly, his blue eyes clear and unwavering. "You need shelter, food, a place to be safe. I can give you that. You can have the back room, your own space. In return, I need a mother for my child." He saw the confusion on her face and clarified, his voice sharp. "I'm not asking you to be my wife. This ain't a proposal of marriage. I'm offering a position, a job. You cook, you clean, you care for the girl. In exchange, you have a roof over your head and food in your belly. A simple arrangement." A simple arrangement. He made it sound like hiring a ranch hand. There was no emotion in his offer, only raw, desperate practicality. He needed a caregiver for his daughter. She needed to survive. It was a trade, a life for a life. Clara looked from the hard, unreadable face of the cowboy to the small, heartbreakingly lonely face of his daughter. Josie was still standing there, watching her, her little face a mask of quiet longing. Clara saw her own desperation mirrored in the child's eyes. They were both adrift. She thought of the alternative, the cold, muddy road, starvation, or worse, being found and dragged back to Montana, to a loveless, suffocating marriage that was a prison in all but name. Here, at least, was a chance. A harsh one, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. Her throat was dry. She swallowed. The sound loud in the quiet room. Her gaze met Silas's. His expression hadn't changed. He was a man waiting for an answer to a business question. "Yes," Clara whispered, the word barely audible. "I accept." Life on the Blackwood homestead took on a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a relentless meter of hard labor. Clara soon learned that the land gave nothing freely. Each day began before dawn, the air still carrying the chill of the high desert night. Her first task was to haul water from the well, a back-breaking chore that left her shoulders aching and her hands raw. The wooden buckets were heavy, and the well rope bit into her palms. Water was a precious currency, rationed for drinking, cooking, and the rare, necessary washing. The parched earth, cracked like old pottery, swallowed any stray drop greedily. The sun, once it cleared the distant mesas, became a physical presence, a weight on her head and neck. She learned to work with her head down, the brim of a borrowed hat shielding her face. Her world reduced to the task at hand. There was always a task. Mending Silas's work shirts by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, her needle dipping in and out of the coarse fabric, churning butter until her arms felt like lead, kneading dough for the dense, smoky bread they baked in a cast-iron pot nestled in the coals of the hearth. She learned the unique challenges of survival in the West, how to render lard, preserve what little meat they had with salt, and recognized the edible greens that grew wild along the creek bed. She took Samson, the steady gelding, on trips to the far pasture to collect eggs from the half-wild chickens that nested there. The horse's familiar warmth, a comfort in the vast, lonely landscape. In the beginning, every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her soft, governess hands became calloused and strong. The sun browned her skin. She grew leaner, tougher, but she did not complain. She pushed through the exhaustion and the pain, her motivation found in the small, silent shadow that often trailed her. Josie. The child was the reason she endured it. Clara saw a fragility in Josie that mirrored her own, a quiet brokenness that she felt a desperate need to mend. For the first few weeks, the girl remained a ghost, communicating in silence and nods, her large blue eyes watching Clara's every move with an unnerving intensity. Clara did not push. She simply included Josie in her day, talking to her softly as she worked, explaining how to fold a blanket or how to crimp the edges of a pie crust, never demanding a response. The first crack in the child's wall of silence came one evening. The wind was howling outside, a mournful sound that made the small cabin feel even more isolated. Silas was in the barn, and the silence inside was thick and heavy. Clara, remembering a tattered book of fairy tales from her past, began to recite a story from memory. She spoke of a princess locked in a tower, a brave knight, and a dragon. Her voice was soft, weaving a world of magic and wonder into the stark reality of their cabin. Josie, who had been sitting listlessly on her small stool, crept closer, her gaze fixed on Clara's face, her lips slightly parted. She was captivated. From then on, the stories became a nightly ritual. Clara's voice was the last thing Josie heard before she slept, a gentle murmur that kept the nightmares at bay. The real turning point, however, came on a hot afternoon when Josie, chasing a lizard, tripped and fell, scraping her hand badly on the rough gravel. She didn't cry out, but sat holding her hand, her face pale, silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Silas would have likely just wiped it on his trousers and told her to be tough, but Clara reacted differently. She drew the girl inside, washed the wound with precious, clean water, and gently applied a soothing herbal salve she had learned to make, as she wrapped the small hand in a strip of soft, clean linen. She hummed a quiet tune. Josie looked down at her bandaged hand, then up at Clara, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than sadness showed in her eyes. It was trust. Silas maintained his distance. He was a man who lived behind walls of his own making, and he had no intention of letting this stranger breach them. The arrangement was clear. She was here for Josie, not for him. He made the boundaries plain in small, unspoken ways. She was not to touch the contents of the small chest at the foot of his bed, nor was she to use the delicate china cup that sat alone on the mantelpiece. These were relics of a past life, of his wife, Sarah, and they were sacrosanct. He spoke to Clara only when necessary, his words clipped and practical, concerning the day's chores or the weather. Yet, he was not blind. As he sat on the porch in the evenings, mending a piece of tack or sharpening a knife, he found his eyes drifting to her. He watched the way she moved, a fluid grace that seemed out of place against the harsh backdrop of the ranch. He noticed the way the fading light of sunset would catch in her hair, turning the simple brown to a rich auburn. He heard the murmur of her voice from inside, telling stories to Josie, a sound that was so fundamentally different from the stark silence that had filled his house for the past year. He would catch himself watching the line of her neck as she bent over the washtub, or the concentration in her face as she coaxed a flame in the hearth. These observations were unwelcome intruders in his carefully guarded grief. They made him feel a stirring of something he had long since buried, and it angered him. He would scowl, turn his attention back to his work, and reinforce the walls around his heart. The unspoken truce of their lives was shattered by the sky itself. One afternoon, the air grew still and heavy, the clouds turning a sickening shade of greenish gray. A hailstorm. It came suddenly, a deafening roar as ice stones, some as large as hen's eggs, began to hammer the earth. The cattle in the nearby corral panicked, bellowing and crashing against the fences. Silas was already running toward them, yelling. Clara, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy blanket and ran out to help, trying to herd a terrified young calf toward the relative safety of the barn. She was nearly there when a chunk of ice struck her temple. The world exploded in a flash of white pain, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the churning mud. The calf bolted. Through a dizzying haze, she saw Silas wrestling the heavy barn door closed before turning back toward her. He moved with an urgency she had never seen in him, his face a mask of grim concern. He reached her in a few long strides, and without a word, he swept her up into his arms. She was startlingly light. He carried her back to the cabin, the hail thundering down around them, and laid her gently on her own cot. The world swam in and out of focus for Clara. She was aware of a dull, throbbing pain in her head and a sharp, stinging sensation on her arm where she had landed on a sharp rock. Through the fog, she was conscious of Silas's presence. He was a constant, steady shadow moving in the lamplight. She felt the gentle touch of a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. She felt his rough, calloused fingers, surprisingly deft, as he cleaned and bandaged the gash on her arm. He didn't leave her side all night. He sat in a chair pulled up to her cot, watching, listening to her breathing. Each time she stirred or moaned softly, he was there, adjusting her blanket or offering a sip of water, in the vulnerable, hazy hours between midnight and dawn. A profound shift occurred. No words were exchanged, but a fragile thread of trust was spun in the silent, watchful dark. He had not just tended to a ranch hand. He had cared for her, and she, in her delirium, had let him. A week later, when the bruise on her temple had faded to a sickly yellow and her arm was healing cleanly, Clara was sweeping the main room. As she moved Silas's heavy armchair to clean behind it, she knocked a small, carved wooden box from a low shelf where it had been hidden from view. It fell to the floor, the lid popping open. A single object lay nestled on a bed of faded velvet, a tin-type photograph. Her heart hammered. She knew this was forbidden territory, one of the sacred relics, but she couldn't stop herself. She picked it up. It was a portrait of Silas and a woman. Silas looked younger, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The woman beside him was beautiful, with dark hair piled high and a smile that lit up her entire face. She held a baby, wrapped in a white blanket, in her arms. Sarah and Josie. The ghost now had a face, and she was lovely. Clara felt a pang of something she couldn't name, a mixture of sorrow for this lost family and a profound sense of her own inadequacy. She was a placeholder, a shadow filling a space once occupied by a brilliant light. She quickly placed the photo back in the box, closed the lid, and put it back in its hiding place, her hands trembling slightly. That night, she understood. She was awakened by a sound, a faint noise cutting through the chirping of the crickets. She lay still, listening. It came again, a choked, guttural sound from the main room, slipping from her bed. She crept to the door and peered through the crack. By the dying embers of the fire, she could see Silas. He was sitting at the table, his shoulders slumped, his head in his hands. The photograph from the box lay before him, and he was weeping. It was not a loud or dramatic grief, but something far more terrible. The silent, wrenching sobs of a man trying to contain a pain so immense it threatened to tear him apart. Clara backed away from the door, her own throat tight with unshed tears. She returned to her bed and lay staring into the darkness, the sound of his quiet agony imprinted on her mind. She finally understood the full depth of his walls. They were not built to keep her out. They were built to hold him together. He had never let go of his wife, not for a single moment. He was still married to her memory, and Clara knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones like a winter chill, that their arrangement would never be anything more than what it was, a simple contract for survival. The fragile peace of the homestead could not remain isolated forever. Like seeds on the wind, news of the woman living at the Blackwood place traveled into Redemption's Bluff. It started as a trickle of curiosity during Silas's rare trips for supplies, a question from the blacksmith or a lingering look from the storekeeper. But when the time came that supplies were low and Silas was mending a fence on the far side of the property, Clara had to make the journey herself, riding the steady gelding, Samson, with Josie perched in front of her. She entered the town's single dusty street and felt the atmosphere shift. Conversations on the boardwalk of the general store did not stop, but their frequency lowered to a conspiratorial buzz. The women of the town, who had previously offered curt but civil nods, now stared. Their eyes raked over her worn but clean dress, her sun-browned skin, and the protective arm she kept around Josie. They saw not a caregiver, but a usurper, a woman of questionable morals living in sin with a grieving widower. The men's looks were different. Some were speculative, others tinged with a crude sort of pity. Clara kept her chin high, purchased her flour and salt, and left as quickly as she could, the weight of their judgment a physical burden on her shoulders. The whispers had found a foothold, and they grew into a quiet, persistent hum that finally reached the ears of Reverend Miller. A week after Clara's visit, the Reverend himself rode out to the Blackwood homestead. He was a tall, gaunt man whose piety was as starched and severe as his collar. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, a time for family and God, a fact that was not lost on Silas. Silas met him on the porch, his stance immediately defensive, a silent warning to the man of God not to cross his threshold. He sent Clara and Josie inside, but the cabin was small, and Clara could hear every word through the single-pane window she was pretending to clean. "Silas," the Reverend began, his voice smooth but firm. "I come as a friend and as a shepherd to his flock." "I'm not in need of shepherding, Reverend." Silas's voice was a low growl. "Perhaps not, but the child is," Miller countered, his tone hardening slightly. "The town is talking. They see a woman, not his kin, living under your roof, an unmarried woman. It creates an impression. What's in my house is my business. Not when a child is involved," the Reverend pressed on, his voice rising with conviction. "It is an unseemly arrangement, Silas. It is a house of impropriety. You have a duty to protect your daughter not only from hardship, but from the stain of scandal. The Ladies' Auxiliary is concerned. The town council has heard whispers. They worry for the girl's moral upbringing." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "They could petition the circuit judge when he passes through next month. They could argue that you are providing an unfit home. They could take her from you." The threat, veiled as it was in righteous concern, struck Silas like a physical blow. Clara saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. The idea that any council of busybodies and hypocrites could rip Josie from him was a violation so profound it made him tremble with a cold, contained rage. "You have no right," Silas bit out, his voice dangerously low. "I have a duty to God and to the children of this community," Miller retorted. "There is a simple solution. My son, a Christian solution, marry the woman. Consecrate the arrangement in the eyes of God and the town. Give the child a proper mother and put an end to the gossip. It is the only way to secure your reputation and your right to raise your daughter." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice flat and dead. "You've said your piece, Reverend. Now get off my land." Reverend Miller, having delivered his ultimatum, gave a stiff nod and departed, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. Silas stormed into the cabin, his face a thunderous mask. He paced the floorboards like a caged wolf, the pent-up fury radiating from him in waves. He was trapped, cornered. The town, with its rigid rules and prying eyes, was forcing his hand. He had built this life of quiet grief and solitude to honor Sarah, to keep her memory pure, to bring another woman into it as his wife felt like the ultimate betrayal, a desecration of the only thing he had left. But then his gaze fell on Josie, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes, and the fury gave way to a cold dread. The Reverend's threat echoed in his mind. They could take her from you. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He could fight the whole town. He could stand on his porch with a rifle and dare them to try, but it would be Josie who paid the price. She would be torn from the only home she'd ever known, handed over to strangers, all because of his own stubborn pride. The rage curdled into a feeling of utter helplessness. Clara, having heard it all, felt a familiar, sickening guilt. She was the source of this turmoil, the scandal, the threat, like a storm cloud. She had brought trouble to this quiet, grieving house. Her past was a history of being a burden, and here she was, doing it again. There was only one solution she could see, the one she had always turned to. She had to disappear. That night, long after Silas had retired to his room and Josie was asleep, Clara packed. She had little to her name, the mended dress she'd arrived in, a few undergarments Silas's late wife had left behind that Clara had patched and repaired, and a small, worn book of poetry. She wrapped them in the wool blanket Silas had first given her. She would leave before dawn. She would walk until she reached the next town, find work, and vanish. It would hurt to leave Josie, a deep, sharp ache unlike any she'd ever known. But it was better than being the cause of the child's ruin. She scribbled a hasty note on a piece of wrapping paper, her words clumsy with apology. She was just about to place it on the table when a tiny voice cut through the darkness. "Are you going away?" Clara froze, her back to the small figure in the doorway. Josie stood there, clutching her rag doll, her small face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. I have to, sweet girl," Clara whispered, her voice thick. "Why?" The question was simple, devastating. "Because I'm causing trouble for you and your father." Josie took a few small steps forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She reached out and her small hand grasped the fabric of Clara's skirt. She held on tight, as if afraid Clara might dissolve into the shadows. "Please," Josie whispered, her voice trembling with the first signs of tears. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave." The simple, desperate plea shattered Clara's resolve. Her carefully constructed plan, her noble sacrifice, crumbled to dust in the face of this small child's raw need. At that moment, a floorboard creaked in the other doorway. Silas stood there, a silent silhouette against the darkness of his room. He had seen and heard everything. He didn't speak, just watched the scene unfold. The woman who was trying to flee and the daughter who was desperately holding her in place. He turned and went back into his room without a word, leaving them alone in the moonlight. Clara stayed, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. The following day was shrouded in an unbearable tension. They moved around each other, the unspoken conversation hanging in the air between them. Silas was quieter than ever, his face carved from stone. Clara's guilt was now mixed with a confusing sense of being anchored, of being wanted. That evening, as Clara was washing the dinner plates, Silas finally spoke. He didn't look at her. He stared at the dark square of the window, his reflection a faint ghost in the glass. "I heard the Reverend," he started, his voice rough. "He's right. They'll do it. They'll take her if things stay as they are." Clara stopped washing, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. She waited. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound of a man on the edge of a cliff. "Josie, she's taken to you. What she said last night." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He turned from the window but still didn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "This ain't how I wanted it. This ain't right by anyone." The words came out haltingly, as if each one was a painful extraction.
"But I can't lose my girl! Clara, I can't!"
He finally looked up, and his blue eyes were filled with a torment so profound it made her ache. "So I'm asking, for Josie's sake, to keep her safe, to give her a name and a proper home, would you marry me?" The question hung in the air, stripped of all romance, a stark and desperate proposal born of necessity. Clara's heart gave a painful, shocking lurch. It was the first time a man had ever asked for her hand, and it was a transaction, a business deal to save a child. Yet, deep beneath the practicality of it all, a tiny, foolish part of her trembled with a strange and terrifying hope. She was afraid of this fortress of a man who still loved his dead wife, afraid of becoming a wife in name only, a permanent ghost in another woman's home, afraid of having her own heart, so long dormant, broken again. I need to think," she stammered, turning back to the sink, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. He simply nodded, a short, sharp movement. "Take your time." For 3 days, a heavy silence reigned. They performed their chores, ate their meals, and lived within the cabin's small confines as if they were strangers sharing a temporary shelter. The proposal was a living thing between them, a constant, unspoken presence. Clara watched him. She saw him patiently showing Josie how to whittle a piece of wood into a bird. She saw the gentleness in his rough hands as he treated a lame horse. She saw the exhaustion and the deep, unyielding grief that settled on his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she stood by the corral fence, watching him work with the horses. He was breaking in a young colt, his movements economical and sure, a silent language of pressure and release passing between man and beast. The setting sun blazed across the horizon, casting the entire landscape in a fiery, golden light. It engulfed him, outlining his strong, solitary figure in flame. He was not a prince from her childhood stories. He was a hard, broken man in a hard, broken land. And yet, in that moment, she saw not just a solution to her problems, but a man of substance, of quiet decency. A man who would fight the world for his child. She saw a future. It was not the future she had dreamed of, but it was real. It was something she could build on. He finished with the colt and turned, walking toward the cabin, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He saw her standing by the fence and paused, his expression guarded, expecting her refusal. She took a breath, the air tasting of dust and sunlight. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening air. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was a spare, solemn affair, held in the town's simple wooden church where sunlight streamed through the tall, unadorned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The pews were mostly empty, occupied only by a handful of curious onlookers, the storekeeper and his wife, the blacksmith, and a few of the ladies from the church auxiliary, their faces a mixture of grudging approval and watchful suspicion. This was not a celebration of love, but a public correction of an impropriety, and the atmosphere was thick with the weight of that transaction. Clara stood beside Silas at the altar, wearing the same cream-colored dress she had been abandoned in. She had meticulously mended the torn hem and washed it until the lace was clean, but it remained a ghost of a wedding gown, a symbol of a past she was now burying for a second time. Josie stood between them, holding both their hands, a small, serious link in this newly forged chain. Reverend Miller's words echoed in the quiet church, speaking of duty, companionship, and the sanctity of a home for a child. There were no joyful tears, no trembling hands, only a stark finality. When Silas had to place a ring on her finger, he produced a simple, unadorned gold band, his first wife's. Clara realized with a pang it was too large for her finger, a cold, heavy circle of another woman's life that now belonged to her. As he slid it on, his calloused thumb brushed against her skin, a brief, impersonal touch. But when she lifted her eyes to his, He was already looking at her. It was not a look of affection. It was a long, deep, and unsettling gaze, an assessment, a weighing of the vows just spoken and the woman who now bore his name. In his eyes, she saw the vast, lonely landscape of his grief, and, for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something else, something she couldn't decipher, before he looked away. The ride back to the homestead was silent. The legal and religious requirements had been met. They were husband and wife, yet the air between them was more fraught than ever. The cabin, which had become a familiar sanctuary, now felt small and charged with an unspoken tension. Josie, exhausted by the day's strange formalities, fell asleep almost immediately. The silence she left behind was deafening. Clara, her heart hammering against her ribs, instinctively moved toward the small cot in the corner that had been her bed. It was her space, her safe territory. She expected Silas to say something, to order her to his bed, to claim the rights the ceremony had just granted him. But he said nothing. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight, then turned and sank heavily into a chair at the table, staring into the cold hearth. She lay down on the cot, fully dressed, pulling a thin blanket over herself. She feigned sleep, listening to the sound of his breathing, the creak of the chair as he shifted his weight. An hour passed, then another. The wind began to pick up outside, a low moan that grew into a desolate howl, rattling the window panes and finding its way through the chinks in the log walls. It sounded like the voice of loneliness itself. Finally, the tension was broken by the scrape of his chair against the floor. Clara's body went rigid, but he didn't approach her. She heard him move to the stove, the clink of the cast-iron kettle, the splash of water from the bucket. He was making tea. After a moment, his quiet voice cut through the sound of the wind. "Can't sleep either?" She sat up, the pretense of sleep abandoned. "No." "Wind's loud tonight," he said, a simple statement of fact that felt like a peace offering. He gestured with his head toward the table. "Might as well have some tea." She joined him, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders. He placed a steaming mug before her, his movements methodical and sure. They sat in silence, the only sounds the shrieking wind outside and the soft sips from their mugs. The shared, simple ritual of drinking tea in the middle of the night slowly began to chip away at the wall of tension between them. It was a neutral act, a moment of shared insomnia that made them not husband and wife, but two people awake in the dark. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. For doing this. For Josie." He looked down into his mug. It was what had to be done. His voice was low, laced with a familiar weariness. They lapsed back into silence, but the quality of it had changed. It was less awkward, more contemplative. He reached for the small pot of honey on the table at the same time she did. Their hands brushed, the back of his rough, work-worn fingers against hers. It was an insignificant, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through Clara's entire body. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He froze, his hand still hovering in the air. Slowly, he looked up, and this time, their eyes met and held. The carefully constructed defenses they had both lived behind for months began to crumble in that single, sustained gaze. She saw past the hard, stoic rancher to the profound loneliness he tried so hard to conceal. He saw past the quiet, capable caregiver to the fear and the deep-seated yearning for safety she kept hidden. The air grew thick, charged with everything left unsaid. The wind howled, pressing in on the small cabin, isolating them from the rest of the world, leaving only the two of them in the warm circle of lamplight. Slowly, as if it were the heaviest thing he had ever lifted, he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. His touch was not demanding, but a quiet, questioning pressure. His palm was rough with calluses, but the touch itself was surprisingly gentle. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She did not pull away. Her heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs, a frantic mix of terror and a strange, unfamiliar hope. He stood, never breaking their gaze, and gently pulled her to her feet. He led her not to his bed, but to the warm space before the hearth, where the embers still glowed a dull red. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering for a moment on her skin. It was a touch of such unexpected tenderness that it made her tremble. For so long, they had existed in this house as functional objects, a caregiver and a provider. But now, in the whispering dark, they were simply a man and a woman. The desire that surfaced was not a sudden, brutish thing, but a slow, deep current that had been running beneath the surface of their lives for months. It was born of shared hardship, of silent observation, of a desperate, unspoken need for human warmth in a cold, unforgiving world. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the kiss she might have expected from such a hard man. It was soft, hesitant at first, a question, when she did not resist. When her own lips softened under his, it deepened, becoming a raw, searching expression of a soul-deep loneliness. It tasted of tea and wood smoke and a sorrow so profound it felt like his own private wilderness. What happened next was not a husband claiming his rights, but two broken people finding solace. It was a slow, tender, and intensely emotional discovery. For Clara, it was the shedding of a lifetime of fear. For Silas, it was a betrayal of his grief that felt terrifyingly like a kind of salvation. His hands, which knew only the rough work of the ranch, learned the soft contours of her body with a reverence that made her want to weep. Every touch was both a question and an answer, an act of taking and giving that was fierce in its gentle intensity. They came together not with the ease of lovers, but with the desperate, fumbling urgency of survivors who had finally found a safe harbor in a storm, clinging to each other as if they were the only two people left in a vast, empty desert. The morning light, when it finally crept through the window, felt like an intrusion. It was gray and unforgiving, and it brought with it the awkward weight of reality. They dressed in silence, carefully avoiding each other's eyes. The profound connection of the night had dissolved into a thick, uncomfortable quiet. Clara's mind raced. To her, the night had been a revelation, an emotional earthquake. But what had it been to him? A duty, a release of pent-up desire, a responsibility he had finally fulfilled. The fear that it meant nothing to him was a cold knot in her stomach. Silas was just as lost. He felt a confusing mix of guilt and a deep, resonant peace he hadn't known was possible. He had been unfaithful to Sarah's memory, a transgression that felt monumental. Yet the feeling of holding Clara, of another living, breathing person in his arms, had chased away the ghosts, if only for a few hours. He had crossed a line, and he didn't know how to find his way back, or if he even wanted to. He was afraid he had taken something from Clara, something he had no right to. It was Josie who broke the spell. She padded into the main room, her hair a mess from sleep, and stopped, looking from Silas's tense frame to Clara's worried face. She sensed the strange new energy in the room. She walked past her father and went straight to Clara, wrapping her small arms around her legs. She looked up, her clear blue eyes full of a simple, trusting love. "Good morning, Mama," she said, her voice bright and clear. The word hung in the air, potent and transformative. Mama? It was the first time she had said it. The sound struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. All his guilt, all his confusion, all his loyalty to the past seemed to fall away in the face of that one simple, powerful word. This was real. This was his daughter, whole and happy. This was the future. He lowered his cup to the table. Clara was looking at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable, waiting for his reaction, bracing for his rejection. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate. Instead, he crossed the room in 2 long strides. He stopped in front of her, looked down at his daughter hugging her legs, and then met Clara's gaze, and for the first time, she saw no walls in his eyes, no ghosts, only a deep, quiet acknowledgement. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm and warm. It wasn't the touch of a stranger or a master, but of a partner. He entwined his fingers with hers, a silent promise, and he didn't let go. With a name and a ring, Clara Blackwood became a new person, at least in the eyes of the town. She was no longer the mysterious stray Silas had taken in, but the respectable wife of a rancher, the new mother of his child. This change, however, did not grant her anonymity. Instead, it placed her under a new, more intense form of scrutiny. On their first trip to town as a married couple for Sunday service, she felt it from the moment they tied the horse to the hitching post outside the church. The women who had once stared with open suspicion now offered thin, brittle smiles. Their eyes, however, missed nothing. They noted the way her dress, though clean and mended, was clearly not new. They observed the way Silas held Josie's hand, and how Clara held the other, forming an unbreachable family unit. Clara could feel their envy, a sharp and bitter thing. She had succeeded where they had failed to imagine. She had captured the town's most solitary and eligible widower. In their eyes, she was an opportunist who had played her hand well. The men's attention had shifted to the speculative, often crude. Curiosity was replaced with a kind of grudging respect for Silas, and by extension, for her. She was his property now, protected by his name and his reputation as a man not to be trifled with. Still, their gazes would linger, trying to puzzle out the woman who had managed to tame the untamable Silas Blackwood. Clara learned to navigate this new landscape of veiled glances and insincere pleasantries. She held her head high, her hand often resting on Josie's shoulder, a silent declaration of her purpose and her place. The gold band on her finger, though still a size too large, felt less like a borrowed ring and more like a shield. A few weeks into their new life, Silas needed to purchase a new plow blade from a supplier 2 towns over. A trip that would take 2 days. He left Clara with a loaded rifle, a list of chores, and a quiet instruction to shoot first if you see trouble. After he was gone, a profound quiet settled over the homestead. It was during this quiet that Clara's past came to find her. She had taken Josie into town for a small sack of candy, a rare treat. As she was leaving the general store, a man dismounting from a fine-looking horse stopped and stared at her. He was well-dressed in a tailored city coat, his face fleshy and florid, his eyes small and shrewd. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over Clara. She knew him, Mr. Elias Abernathy. He was a business associate of her father's, a man whose damp, grasping hands had tried to find their way onto her on more than one occasion. He was a central figure in the web of obligations that had led to her betrothal to the old cattle baron. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a rich, syrupy drawl that turned her stomach. "Clara May Thompson. I'd heard you'd run off like a spooked filly. Your father was most displeased." Clara pulled Josie behind her, her body a protective wall.
You are mistaken, sir,
she said, her voice tight and cold. "My name is Clara Blackwood." Abernathy's eyes flicked to the ring on her finger, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Blackwood? So you landed on your feet. Found some dirt scratcher to take you in." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "But does this Blackwood know the full story? Does he know why your own family was so eager to see you married off? Does he know about your spirited nature? About the trouble you caused?" The insinuation was as clear as it was vile. He was referring to the night she had fought him off in her father's study, a struggle that had ended with a torn dress and a slap across her face from her father. For embarrassing a guest, her family had sided with him. calling her a liar and an instigator to cover their own shame and protect their business interests. That was the secret she carried. Not just the assault, but the betrayal.
Leave us alone,
she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady.
I don't think so,
he purred, enjoying her fear. I find myself in this dreary little town for a few days on a land deal. Perhaps you and I have some unfinished business to discuss. Or perhaps I'll have a chat with your new husband instead. I'm sure he'd be very interested in the kind of woman he's married. The threat hung in the air. A poisoned dart aimed at the heart of her fragile new life. With a final, lingering look that made her skin crawl, he tipped his hat and sauntered into the saloon. Clara, trembling, practically ran to the horse and fled town, her mind a maelstrom of panic. That night was the longest of her life. Every creak of the cabin, every hoot of an owl, sounded like Abernathy coming to make good on his threat. When Silas returned the next afternoon, the relief she felt was immediately replaced by a new terror. She had to tell him. To live with this secret, waiting for it to explode, was a torture she couldn't bear. But the fear of his reaction was just as potent. He was a man of honor and pride. What would he do when he learned he had married a woman her own family had discarded as damaged goods? After Josie was asleep, she found him on the porch, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. She stood in the doorway, wringing her hands, until he finally looked up, his brow furrowed at her obvious distress. "What is it, Clara?" The story tumbled out of her, hesitant and broken. She told him about Abernathy, about her father's debts, about the arranged marriage, and then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she told him about the incident in the study, about how Abernathy had forced his attentions on her, and how, when she had fought back, her family had branded her a liar and cast her out. She confessed the full, shameful reason for her flight, not just from a marriage, but from a reputation that had been deliberately and cruelly destroyed. As she spoke, she watched his face, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The warmth that had begun to grow between them vanished. His expression closed down, the muscles in his jaw tightening until his face looked as if it were carved from granite. His eyes, which had recently started to look at her with a kind of gentle wonder, became chips of ice. He was a stranger again, the cold, impenetrable man she had first met in the abandoned shed. When she finished, the silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at the rifle parts laid out on the oilcloth before him, his gaze frozen. Clara's heart sank. This was it. This was the revulsion, the judgment she had been dreading her entire life. He believed she was sullied, ruined. He would tell her to leave in the morning. Finally, he stood up, his movements stiff. He didn't look at her. He walked past her, off the porch, and strode toward the barn, disappearing into the darkness. The door creaked shut behind him. He had left her. The finality of the act was like a physical blow, and a dry, tearless sob caught in her throat. She waited for what felt like an eternity, standing frozen on the porch, every passing second confirming her worst fears. She was about to turn and go inside to pack her meager belongings when the barn door creaked open again. He emerged from the darkness and walked back toward her, his long strides eating up the ground. He stepped onto the porch, stopping directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He smelled of hay and horse and the cold night air. He looked down at her, and his eyes were no longer frozen. They were clear and intense, burning with an emotion she couldn't name. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, but it held a certainty that vibrated through the very floorboards. "I don't care who you were before," he said, the words stark and simple. "I don't care what they said you were. I care about who you are, right here, to me, to Josie." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You are my wife. This is your home, and no one is going to run you out of it." The words were a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was rusted shut. The dam of her restraint, built over years of fear and shame, broke. A raw, ragged cry was torn from her, and she began to sob, not quietly, but with deep, shuddering gasps that shook her entire frame. It was the sound of a pain so old she had forgotten what it was like to not carry it. Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as she wept. He didn't offer platitudes or try to quiet her. He just held her, his large, strong hands stroking her hair, his body a solid, unshakable anchor in her storm. For the first time in her life, Clara felt utterly safe. She felt seen. She felt believed. She felt loved. Later that night, when her tears were spent and a profound, exhausted peace had settled over her, he led her to their bed. This time was different. The first time they had come together, it had been a collision of two lonely souls seeking comfort. This was something else entirely. It was not an act of passion, but of consecration. When he touched her, it was with a reverence that healed. It was a slow, deliberate act of worship, a silent vow to protect and to cherish. It was her complete surrender, not of her body, but of her trust. She was giving him all the broken pieces of herself, and he was accepting them, holding them, and making them whole. In the quiet dark of the cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, they were no longer two people bound by a contract, but a husband and a wife, forging a new world, a new life, out of truth and acceptance. The tentative peace they had built was as fragile as a scrap of paper in the wind, and the season was about to change. The relentless sun finally relented, giving way to a sky the color of slate. The rain, when it came, was not the gentle, life-giving shower of a softer land. It was a deluge, a relentless assault that turned the cracked earth into a sea of thick, red mud. The creek swelled, and a constant, chilling dampness seeped into the very logs of the cabin, a dampness that carried its own dangers. It began with a listlessness in Josie. The child, who had started to laugh and run with a newfound freedom, grew quiet and pale. At first, Clara thought it was just the gloom of the endless rain. Then came the chills. One afternoon, Josie began to shiver violently, her small teeth chattering uncontrollably, even as Clara wrapped her in every blanket they owned and held her close to the fire. By nightfall, the shivering gave way to a frightening, consuming heat. The fever was a thief, stealing the color from Josie's cheeks and the light from her eyes, leaving her delirious and whimpering, her small body burning to the touch. Silas rode like a madman into Redemption's Bluff, the mud sucking at his horse's hooves. He returned hours later, his face a mask of grim despair. The town doctor, a well-meaning but often drunk old man, had nothing for the malaria, the swamp fever that plagued the lowlands during the wet season. His supply of quinine, the only known remedy, had run out weeks ago. "He said to pray," Silas said, his voice a low, ragged sound of fury and helplessness as he stood dripping in the doorway. He looked at the small, feverish form on the bed, and a look of such profound agony crossed his face that Clara had to look away. That night, they took turns, but there was little they could do but wipe her brow with cool cloths and force sips of water between her cracked lips. By the second day, she was barely conscious. "There's a man," Silas said, his voice strained as he stared out at the gray, weeping sky. "Jedediah Kane lives up north, across Whisper Creek Pass. He's a healer of sorts. He'll have the medicine." Clara's blood ran cold. Whisper Creek Pass was notorious. It was a treacherous maze of canyons and narrow trails, a place where the law didn't go. It was the favored hunting ground of road agents and outlaws, men who would kill a man for his boots. "You can't," she whispered. "It's too dangerous. The trail will be a river of mud." "I can't stay here and watch her die," he countered, his voice raw. He turned to face her, and his eyes were burning with a desperate resolve. "I have to go. Clara, you have to be strong. You have to keep her here until I get back." He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You have to—" He was gone before dawn. a solitary figure on his strongest horse, melting into the gray mist. The cabin, once a sanctuary, became a pressure cooker of fear and silence, punctuated only by the shallow, rasping breaths of the sick child. Clara was alone. The next 48 hours blurred into a single, endless vigil. Time ceased to be measured by the sun, which was hidden behind the clouds, and instead was marked by the changing of damp cloths and the doling out of single drops of water. Clara did not sleep. She sat by Josie's bed, a constant, watchful presence. She bathed the child's burning skin, feeling the terrifying heat radiate from the small body. She held Josie's limp hand, whispering stories, singing the lullabies she remembered from her own childhood, her voice a low, continuous murmur against the drumming of the rain. The smell of sickness was a cloying, sweet thing in the air, a scent she fought back with a fierce and desperate will. She watched the fever's cruel rhythm, the way it would seem to break, giving her a sliver of false hope, only to return with an even greater, more vicious intensity. During the worst of it, Josie's small body would arch in delirium, her eyes rolling back as she whimpered for her mother. "Mama?" she would cry, the sound a knife in Clara's heart, and Clara would lean close, her own tears falling on the child's sweaty brow, and whisper, "I'm here, sweet girl, Mama's here." Sometime during the second night, when the lamp was burning low and her own body was screaming with exhaustion, Clara found herself on her knees. She had not prayed in years. God, to her, had been a distant, judgmental figure, the author of the rules that had condemned her. But now, kneeling on the rough floorboards of the cabin, she did not pray to that God. She spoke into the darkness as if to a last, unknown friend. Her prayer was not eloquent. It was a raw, broken plea. "Please," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I don't ask for myself. I have never asked for myself. But her, she is innocent. She has known so much loss. Please don't take her. Take anything from me. Take my health, my future, anything. But let her live. Please." Meanwhile, Silas was fighting a different battle. The trail through Whisper Creek Pass was worse than he had imagined. A treacherous river of mud and slick rock where one misstep could send a horse and rider plunging into the canyon below. The rain was relentless, blinding him, turning his oilskin coat into a heavy, sodden weight. He was navigating a particularly narrow stretch of trail, a place where the canyon walls pressed in on either side, when a figure stepped from behind a rock outcropping, a rifle leveled at his chest. The man was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his clothes little more than rags, his face bearing the desperate, feral look of a starving wolf. "That's far enough, mister," the man rasped. "Heard you came through town in a hurry. A man in that much of a hurry is either running from the law or running toward a payroll. Get off the horse." "I've got no money," Silas said, his voice calm, his hands held high and open. "I'm on an errand of mercy. My daughter is dying." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Ain't we all? I figure a man with a fine horse like that and a good coat has something of value. The saddlebags, toss 'em down. There's nothing in them but some dried jerky and a bedroll." "Let me be the judge of that," the man sneered, gesturing with the rifle. As Silas made a move to unbuckle the bags, a glint of sunlight, a rare break in the clouds, reflected off the silver flask at Silas's hip. "What's that?" the man demanded, his eyes narrowing. "Silver? It's just water." "Liar!" the man shrieked, his desperation boiling over into rage. "You've got gold! Give it to me!" He lunged forward, and in that split second, Silas reacted. He threw himself from the saddle, hitting the muddy ground hard and rolling, pulling the Colt from his holster as he came up. The bandit's rifle exploded, the shot deafening in the narrow canyon. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Silas's coat, grazing his arm with a line of fire. Before the man could lever another round, Silas fired. His shot was aimed low, not to kill, but to incapacitate. It struck the man in the thigh, and he went down with a scream of pain and rage. Silas was on him in an instant, kicking the rifle away. He stood over the man, his pistol aimed at the man's head, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. He could end it. He could pull the trigger and rid the world of one more predator. But as he looked at the man, writhing in the mud, he saw not a monster, but a desperate, broken creature. And he couldn't do it. He holstered his pistol, ripped a strip of cloth from the man's own tattered shirt to fashion a crude tourniquet, and left him there, remounting his horse and riding on without a backward glance. He found Jedediah Kane's cabin an hour later. Jed was a man forged by the frontier, with a past as murky as the creek water. He'd once ridden with a gang, but had traded his pistol for a medicine bag years ago after a brush with death. He was a man who understood desperation. He listened to Silas's story, patched his bleeding arm, and, without a word, produced a small, dark bottle filled with a precious bitter powder, quinine. "This is all I have," Jed said. "Give her a small dose every 4 hours. Keep her warm. The rest is up to God and her own will to live." The journey back was a fever dream of its own. Silas pushed himself and his horse to the limits of their endurance, his own pain and exhaustion a distant hum beneath the roaring urgency of his mission. He arrived back at the homestead on the evening of the 3rd day, just as dusk was bleeding into night. He was a terrifying sight. His coat was torn, his face was pale with exhaustion and streaked with mud and dried blood, and his arm was bound in a crude, bloody bandage. Clara heard the horse and flew to the door. When she saw him, a strangled cry escaped her lips. She ran to him as he stumbled from the saddle, and she threw her arms around him, clinging to him with a desperate strength. She was trembling from head to foot, not with relief, but with the sheer, visceral terror of what he had endured, of how close she had come to losing him, too. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with the aftershocks of his ordeal. For a long moment, they just stood there in the mud and the rain, holding each other up. They administered the medicine, and Clara sat by Josie's side through another long night, watching, waiting. Sometime before dawn, she felt a change. The consuming heat that had raged for days began to recede. Josie's breathing, once shallow and ragged, deepened, becoming more even, more peaceful, when the first pale light of morning filtered into the cabin. Josie's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer glassy with fever, but clear. She was weak, her face drawn and pale, but she was lucid. She looked at Clara, and a tiny, faint smile touched her lips. Clara felt a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. Tears streamed down her face, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. She leaned down and gently kissed the child's forehead, a brow that was finally cool to the touch. "You are not of my flesh," Clara whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it felt as if her heart might burst. "But you are of my heart. You are my daughter." Josie's recovery was a slow but steady dawn, each day bringing a little more light back into her eyes and color to her cheeks. The oppressive rain finally gave way to a clean, sun-scoured sky, and a fragile sense of normalcy returned to the homestead. The bond between Clara and Silas, forged in the crucible of fear and tested by the ghosts of her past, had settled into a quiet, powerful intimacy. They moved around each other with a new and easy grace, the space between them no longer filled with unspoken questions, but with a deep, comfortable understanding. It was into this newfound peace that the outside world intruded once more. It arrived in the form of a letter, carried into Redemption's Bluff by a traveling mail rider. The envelope was crisp and white, of a quality not seen in this part of the country, and the handwriting was her father's elegant, severe script. The sight of it made Clara's stomach clench with an old, familiar dread. Letters from home did not bring good news. She waited until Josie was asleep for her nap before she opened it. Silas sitting at the table across from her, watching her face. The letter was 4 pages long, written in her mother's hand but dictated, Clara knew, by her father. It began with an effusive, hollow declaration of how they had prayed for her safety and how their hearts had ached with worry. It spoke of forgiveness, of a parent's boundless love for a wayward child, and of their desire to welcome her back into the fold. The words were coated in sugar, but the poison was in the core. Mr. Abernathy passed through on his return journey, her mother wrote, and informed us of your situation. We were, of course, horrified to learn you had fallen in with such a common sort and were living in a state of hardship. While we cannot condone your rash and disobedient actions, we are prepared to be charitable. Mr. Alastair Finch, in his great magnanimity and affection for you, is still willing to honor the arrangement. He understands you went through a period of youthful folly and is prepared to overlook it. Your father has smoothed things over. You must simply come home. We will have this unfortunate marriage of yours annulled. A simple matter for a man of Mr. Finch's influence, and you can take your rightful place as his wife. We have enclosed funds for your travel. We expect to see you within the month. Clara read the last lines twice, a cold fury mixing with the bitter taste of resignation. They hadn't changed. They had never cared about her happiness or her safety, only about the transaction. In their eyes, she was not a person but a commodity that had been temporarily misplaced. Her marriage to Silas, the life she had fought for, the love she had found. They dismissed it all as a folly, a dirty little chapter to be erased so the proper business of her life could resume. They were not offering forgiveness. They were issuing a summons. She slid the letter across the table to Silas. She watched his face as he read it, saw his eyes darken and a muscle jump in his jaw. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it in the center of the table, a stark white rectangle of trouble between them. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. Clara held her breath, a terrible fear creeping in. Would he see the logic in it? The life they offered her was one of ease and wealth, a world away from the back-breaking labor of the ranch. The life she had with him was one of constant struggle, of uncertainty, of danger. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and devoid of anger. They can offer you a life I can't. Clara, a world without calloused hands and droughts and sick children. A world with silk dresses and security. He looked at her then, and his eyes were clear and steady, filled not with possessiveness, but with a profound, heartbreaking sincerity. This is your choice, not mine, not theirs. If you want that life, if you think it will make you happy, I will not hold you. I'll not be a cage for any woman, least of all you. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You follow your heart. Whatever it tells you to do, I'll understand. He was offering to let her go. In that moment, offering her the freedom to leave him. He bound her to him more tightly than any vow. She saw the depth of his love for her, a love so true it valued her happiness above his own. She looked at his hand covering hers, the strong, calloused fingers, the hand that had held hers through Josie's sickness, the hand that had held her in the dark as she wept for her past. She thought of her father's hands, which had only ever signed contracts and pointed the way out. The choice was not a choice at all. She pulled the letter toward her, and on the blank space at the bottom of the last page, she took the pen and ink from the mantel and began to write. Her own script was not as elegant as her father's, but it was firm and clear. Mother and father, she wrote, you speak of forgiveness, but you have never seen me. You see only a daughter who has failed in her duty to be sold. You are wrong. I have never been more dutiful than I am now, in my duty to my own heart and to my own family. I am not living in hardship. I am living in a home filled with a love you cannot comprehend. My husband is a good and honorable man, something you know little about, I will not be returning, not in a month, not ever. My daughter needs a father like him, and I need to live as myself, not as a prize to be won. Do not write to me again. I wish you no ill, but my life is here now." She signed it simply, Clara Blackwood. She folded the paper, slipped it into a fresh envelope Silas provided, and addressed it. The act felt like shutting the final door on a cold, dark room, locking it, and walking away into the sun. As if to test their resolve, the land threw another challenge at them. A week after the letter was sent on its way with the mail rider, a sudden thaw in the mountains sent a flash flood roaring down the valley. The creek swelled its banks, and a torrent of brown water and debris surged across their lower pasture, washing away the new seeds they had just planted and tearing a hole in the side of the barn. When the water receded, it left behind a thick blanket of stinking mud and a scene of devastation. It was a heartbreaking setback, but this time, they did not face it alone or as separate individuals. They faced it as partners. They worked from sunup to sundown, side by side. They hauled buckets of water together to wash the filth from the barn floor. They salvaged what timber they could and worked as a team to repair the wall, his strength matching her nimble persistence. They took the horses and plow and turned the mud-soaked field, preparing the soil once more for a late-season planting. The work was grueling, but there was no despair in it. There was only a shared purpose, a quiet rhythm of labor that was its own kind of love language. A few weeks later, they were in Redemption's Bluff, loading supplies onto their wagon. The sun was hot, and the work of hoisting heavy sacks of flour and feed had left them both covered in a fine layer of dust. Clara paused to push a stray, sweat-dampened strand of hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Silas stopped what he was doing and just looked at her. He stood there in the middle of the street, in front of the whole town, and simply looked at his wife. A slow, warm smile spread across his face, a smile of such open and unabashed affection that it made her breath catch. He stepped toward her, and in front of the watchful eyes of the storekeeper and the sharp-eyed women of the town, he gently cupped her face in his hand. He used his thumb to wipe the smudge from her cheek, and then he leaned down and pressed a simple, tender kiss to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, public tenderness. It was a declaration, more powerful than any words, for all to see. This is my wife. This is the woman I choose, the woman I cherish. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, blurring the dusty street and the curious faces of the townspeople. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. For her entire life, she had been a source of shame or a commodity to be traded. In that one simple gesture, Silas had honored her, had declared her precious in the sight of all. And the town saw it. They saw the way he looked at her, the way she looked at him. They saw the easy partnership between them as they finished loading their wagon. It was not a grand gesture, but it was undeniable. It was real. And in the West, reality, hard-won and authentic, was something to be respected. As they were about to leave, the storekeeper's wife, a woman who had once looked at Clara with cold suspicion, came out onto the boardwalk. She carried a small paper bag. "For Josie," she said, offering it to Clara. It was filled with lemon drops. "She's a strong little girl. You're a good mother to her." And this time, her smile was genuine. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. The whispers were finally starting to fade, replaced by a grudging, growing respect. The summer that followed was long and unforgiving. The sun baked the land until the earth was the color of rust and the grass crackled underfoot. The creek shrank to a muddy trickle, and the air grew thick with a hazy, oppressive heat. From the west, a new threat began to gather. Not in the clouds, but on the horizon. A distant, smoky plume that grew larger each day, staining the sunsets a terrifying, bloody orange, wildfire. It was a beast born of drought and heat, and it moved with a malevolent, unstoppable hunger. By the time the town of Redemption's Bluff realized the danger, the beast was at their doorstep, A rain of fine gray ash began to fall, dusting everything with a film of death. The air grew acrid, tasting of smoke and fear. The sky, even at midday, was a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The fire came on the back of a hot, dry wind. It did not creep, it roared. It surged over the mesas and down into the valley like a wave of liquid flame, an advancing army with a sound like a freight train, devouring everything in its path. The town became a frantic hive of activity. Men formed bucket brigades from the town well, their efforts pitiably small against the inferno. Women gathered the children in the stone church, the safest building, their faces pale with terror. For those on the outlying homesteads, there was no help. It was just them against the fire. Silas worked with a feverish intensity, digging fire breaks, dousing the cabin roof with precious water, his face a mask of grim determination. Clara, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, worked beside him, her movements swift and sure. She gathered Josie and the most essential supplies: water, a small sack of food, the tin box with Sarah's photograph, and readied the wagon, her mind a clear, cold bastion of practicality against the rising panic. The fire was upon them. A wall of flame, 50 feet high, crested the ridge behind their property. The heat was a physical blow, and the roar was a deafening, all-consuming sound. The horses in the barn screamed, a high, terrified sound of pure animal panic. "Get Josie in the wagon! Go now!" Silas yelled over the din, his voice hoarse. "Take her to the creek bed on the far side of the valley. Wait for me there." Clara scooped up the terrified, weeping child and ran for the wagon. She did as he said, her heart hammering, her trust in him absolute. But as she urged the wagon horse into a frantic gallop, she looked back. The barn had caught. Flames were licking up the dry timber walls with terrifying speed. She saw Silas run toward it. He wasn't running away. He was running in. For the horses, his livelihood, the two animals he hadn't been able to set free in time. She reached the relative safety of the creek bed and deposited a sobbing Josie into the care of another family that had fled there. "Watch her!" she screamed at the woman, who could only nod, her own face white with shock, and then, without a second thought, Clara turned and ran back. She ran toward the fire. The heat was so intense it seared her lungs. Embers rained down around her, burning small holes in her dress. The world was a chaotic nightmare of smoke and roaring flame. As she neared the barn, she saw what had happened. A heavy roof beam, engulfed in flames, had collapsed, blocking the main entrance, and Silas was inside. She could hear him shouting, his voice muffled, trying to calm the screaming horses. He was trapped. The townspeople who had been trying to fight the blaze near the road saw her running toward the inferno. "Mrs. Blackwood, no!" someone shouted. "It's suicide!" She didn't hear them. All she heard was the sound of Silas's voice. All she saw was the vision of the life they had built being consumed by the flames. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into this land with nothing. She was a wife, a mother, and her husband was about to die. She found a smaller side door, blocked by a pile of burning hay, with a strength born of pure adrenaline. She kicked and clawed at the smoldering bales, ignoring the pain as the heat blistered her hands. She burst through into the suffocating, smoke-filled interior. It was like hell itself. Smoke blinded her, and the heat was a solid wall. She could just make out Silas's form through the haze, trying to heave the fallen beam, the terrified horses rearing behind him. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice a raw croak. He turned, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "Clara, get out, now!" "Not without you!" she shrieked back. She saw a long, sturdy piece of a broken stall divider on the ground. A lever. She grabbed it, the wood hot to the touch, and jammed it under the edge of the heavy, burning beam. "Push!" she screamed at him. He understood. He threw his own weight against the beam from the other side. together, their bodies straining, muscles screaming in protest. They moved it. Just enough. An opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He shoved the panicked horses through the gap first, slapping their rumps to send them galloping into the smoky haze. Then he scrambled through himself, turning to pull her after him just as the rest of the roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a volcano of sparks and flame into the sky. They stumbled out into the open air, falling to their knees, gasping, choking, their bodies covered in soot and sweat. They were alive. They clung to each other, their hearts pounding in unison. The roar of the fire, their only witness. The homestead was lost. The barn was a funeral pyre, and the fire was now sweeping toward their small cabin. But they were alive, and they were together. The fire burned for 2 days before a shift in the wind and an unexpected downpour finally tamed its rage. It left behind a world transformed. The landscape was a uniform black, a desolate, smoking ruin under a gray sky. The Blackwood homestead was gone. The barn was a pile of charred timbers. The cabin, miraculously, still stood, but it was heavily scorched, its porch consumed, one wall blackened and burned through. Everything they had worked for, everything they had rebuilt, had been turned to ash. But something else had happened. The town had seen. They had seen the wife, the outsider, the woman of questionable background, run into a burning building to save her husband. They had seen an act of courage and love so pure and undeniable, it swept away the last vestiges of their prejudice. As Silas and Clara stood surveying the wreckage, their faces smudged with soot, their clothes torn, people began to arrive, not to stare, but to help. The blacksmith came with his wagon, offering salvaged lumber. The storekeeper's wife brought a basket of food and a jug of clean water. Several ranchers whose properties had been spared came with their sons, offering their hands to help rebuild. Reverend Miller approached them, his usual stern expression replaced by one of profound, quiet respect. He looked at Clara, and for the first time he saw not a scandal, but a woman of incredible strength. "The Lord tests us with fire," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "And you, my child, have emerged from it with grace." They started over. From the ashes, they began to build again. The work was slow, heartbreaking, and backbreaking. But this time, they were not alone. Their neighbors worked alongside them, and the three of them, Silas, Clara, and Josie, were the unshakable foundation. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden, forgiving light over the blackened land, the three of them stood together in the ruins of their yard. Josie, resilient as a wildflower, was drawing patterns in the ash with a stick. Clara stood beside Silas, watching her. Her hand was black with charcoal, and she reached out, taking his own equally grimy hand in hers. She held it tight, a small, strong anchor in the devastation. She looked up at him, her face serious, her eyes clear and filled with a love that had been tempered and proven in the flames. "You once told me you needed a mother for your child," she said, her voice quiet but strong amidst the silence of the burnt world. "And you were right. She did." She paused, her grip on his hand tightening. "But now I need a husband for the rest of my life." A slow smile spread across Silas's face. It was not the weary half-smile she had seen so many times before. It was a smile of pure, unburdened happiness. A smile that reached his eyes and lit them from within, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was the smile of a man who was no longer just surviving, but was finally, truly, living. He leaned down, and in the golden light, surrounded by the ashes of their past, he kissed her. It was a kiss not of desperate need or hesitant discovery, but of absolute certainty, of a future they would build together, from the ground up, with their own two hands and their whole, healed hearts. Thank you for listening to this story around our campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, We invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.